Have you spent a significant amount of time living outside your passport country during your developmental years? Do you come from an expat, military, diplomat, missionary, or international business family background? If so, then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to the TCK Research Podcast, where we discuss the current state of research on third culture kids, cross-culture kids, expat families, and international life in general.
My name is Andrea Schmidt, and I've been an expat for over 30 years, having lived in a total of 9 countries. I'm a coach for TCK girls, and I'm currently completing my master's degree in psychology.
And I'm Mathieu Gagnon, an adult third culture kid who grew up in 6 countries until the age of 15. And I'm now a professor of psychology in Ontario, Canada.
Every episode, we bring you a fascinating conversation with a leading researcher in the field.
If you're listening on YouTube or another platform, please subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, please press the thumbs up or like button, share it on your social media platforms, or send it to a friend.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com.
Let's jump right in.
Enjoy the podcast.
Today's guests are Doctors Courtney Giboi and Sanjay Nath. Dr. Giboi, PsyD, is a clinical psychologist and founder of Via Psychology in San Diego, offering therapy, consultation, and supervision. She specializes in trauma, identity, neurodiversity, and cultural adjustment across the lifespan. With a decade of experience, she provides tailored care for survivors of complex trauma, multicultural and transnational families, and the LGBTQ+ community. A lifelong advocate, she champions ethical, accessible mental health care worldwide. Dr. Nath, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and founder of Many Rivers Collective in Philadelphia, which centers on immigration, acculturation, and intercultural experiences. He has served as professor and program director at Widener University's PsyD program. His work focuses on identity, meaning-making, global mental health, relational psychoanalysis, and social justice, exploring how systems and socio-political forces shape our mental well-being. And in this episode, we're talking about their 2023 paper entitled A Qualitative Examination of Transnational Identity Development in Multicountry Immersers, published in the journal International Perspectives in Psychology. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the TCK Research Podcast. Today, our guests are Courtney and Sanjay. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Courtney is calling in from San Diego, and Sanjay is calling in from Philadelphia. So we've got 2 cities today in the podcast. Listeners might recognize that this is a special episode because we've doubled the number of guests. Andrea, haven't we?
We have. And I'm calling in from Cancun, Mexico. Mathieu, you?
I am calling in from Kingston, Ontario, Canada.
Oh, perfect.
Yes. We're kind of everywhere, aren't we?
Yeah,
It's amazing that we're able to do this. And I know there are some listeners who are like in Thailand and in some country and then in South Africa and so on. And so maybe just take a second to realize how incredible that is.
Yeah.
All right. So today we wanted to speak to both of you because we really enjoyed your paper on multi-country immersers. But before we start talking about the paper, we always like to start by getting to know a little bit about the guests, and specifically the guests in terms of their relationship with the concept of third culture kids or expats or global mobility. And so let me ask generally, what are both of your TCK or expat backgrounds or stories?
Sure. So I'm Courtney Giboi. I was born in Los Angeles, California, in the US, in I would say, a blended multicultural family. And then I spent about 2 years in high school in Ensenada, Mexico. And I found the experience really culturally immersive and rich, but there was also a lot of trauma there. I was alone. I would say it was a very, very difficult, traumatic experience. And then I had really the privilege of having a chosen immersive experience when I went abroad during college. So I went to Germany and I lived in Germany for a year. I traveled throughout Europe. I had the best time. This is great. I love this.
Mhm.
And then I decided to move back to Germany. I was on a 90-day visa. I hope I can find a job with the plan of staying for a year. That year turned into really an 8-year journey.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah, it was again, I think, a metaphor for we go down one path and other paths open,
Yep.
Yeah.
which at least explaining that to Americans sometimes isn't understandable. So I had to kind of explain that or even sell that to people. What do you mean you didn't have a plan or a goal? I did. I just learned some new experiences and I liked it, so I stayed, to be,
Yeah.
totally honest.
Hmm.
Being versus doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a really,
Sorry,
really great,
as
yeah.
the Germany, yeah, Courtney, where were you in Germany?
I was in Bonn.
Okay.
Bonn,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, and then I moved back to Bonn after finishing my bachelor's, and I lived there for about 4 years. I did find the job. I did make some money to survive. I ended up doing a master's degree. And then I had that third country really experience, or actually it would have been fourth country, but third, host country experience moving to the
Right.
Netherlands for
Mm.
work. And again, it was a great, rich experience. And then I just kind of reached that point in my career where I was like, I always wanted to be a psychologist. I got to do this. So my partner and I, also a transnational, moved back to the US to get my doctorate in clinical psychology. And that's been its own 10-year repatriation experience, including, now the career side as a psychologist.
Yeah. Awesome.
Very
Awesome.
interesting.
Very interesting story
Thank
indeed.
you.
And for yourself, Sanjay?
Yes. I My name is Sanjay Nath. I'm here in Philadelphia. I was born in the city of Boston in the United States to recently immigrated parents who are from South India, specifically Kerala on the southwest coast of India. And it was a typical immigrant story. They were folks who arrived with $10 in their pocket and first time experiencing snow in Boston. They had grown up in rural Kerala, and I had that kind of bicultural or hyphenated experience of many children of immigrants spending summers traveling back to Kerala to visit
Mhm.
extended family. Our family spoke a South Indian language called Malayalam.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
and growing up in the US in a conservative immigrant family that kind of insisted on preserving a version of pre immigration life while in a majority white society, that's really shaped me. I mean, earlier
Yeah.
in my life, I've used the hyphen of South Asian American or a hyphenated or hybrid identity. But I became a psychologist, a clinical psychologist as well, in part to understand my own intergenerational journey, issues of loss and trauma within my own family. The more you look into mobility, the more you realize there's a lot that happens in these transitions that gets glossed over. And really an interest and joy in trying to find how to explore and aid others who experience identities shaped by migration. So I'm kind of more in that dual culture framework, but
Yeah.
excited to be here
Mm.
and talk with you all.
Yeah. Very nice.
So
I think that
interesting. Thanks for sharing.
partly answers your next question, doesn't it, Andrea, about what
Yeah,
motivated the yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that was
You can
would have
still
been the
ask it
question. Like,
on this. Yeah.
now we sort of did, right? Like how your background influenced your interest. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So
Right.
I
Right.
think you both answered that very well. Yep. So I take number three, Mathieu. We
Take number
switch
three.
questions.
We'll switch. We're doing
Oh
this
my
live,
God.
ladies and gentlemen.
Exactly. So we're diving right into your paper, which is called a qualitative Examination of Transnational Identity Development in Multicountry Immersers. And you start your paper by explaining that current global changes challenge traditional ways of thinking about nationality, acculturation, and identity. In particular, you claim that the models we have thus far are not complex enough, and you introduce the term called transnationalism. So what can you tell us about the meaning of this term and about the limits of the current models to explain the concept?
Yeah, I can dive in here. I think one thing Courtney and I both noticed when we were starting to get deeper into the literature and begin to think about the research process is that there's a lot of different pools of research. There's research on global nomads, there's research on expats, there's research on international students, as well as third culture kids or third culture adults. And sometimes they focus on specific populations or specific subgroups or different experiences. They sometimes struggle to talk to each other. It almost starts sometimes with a group to look at and then trying to go from there. And one thing we liked about the term transnationalism, which is a kind of interdisciplinary term, is it draws from anthropology, economics, migration theory, other psychology, other areas of study. And it talks a little bit under the umbrella of transnationalism about focusing less on national boundaries and an evolution towards a concept that acknowledges a kind of broader set of things that move people. People, capital, economics are all moved under the umbrella of transnationalism. So it's kind of a broad interdisciplinary concept. And a kind of umbrella term that encapsulates a lot of different people's experiences, including third culture experiences or nomads. And one thing we love about the concept is it kind of makes a more direct allusion to the systems, the technologies, the global world that's shaping folks, shaping individuals. It's kind of an embedded identity. And I think it helps break out as well out of this binary or trinary of 2 or 3 country comparison to think about a kind of global or transnational identity at a broad level. So we really love that. There's actually a lot of books and other pieces written in the social sciences about transnationalism. And I, for one, hope it's a term that catches on more and becomes more widely used or thought about.
Agreed. Yeah, it's interesting because it's really, I'm thinking like the literal opposite of that is like thinking in terms of nation states and identify to a specific piece of land with border. And you're saying you can feel it's a kind of like this, well, exactly, this transnationalism. It's a kind of a more fuzzy, dynamic thing. It's very interesting. And in order to increase our understanding of the processes that contribute to this formation of a transnational identity, you study very specific individuals and you document their experiences. And these are individuals that you call multi-country immersers. Now, listeners will be used to the term third culture kids or expat. I know for me, it was the first time that I read the term multi-country immersers, also known as MCIs, because we love acronyms. Can you explain what this term means? What is exactly a multi-country immerser?
Yes, I'm happy to answer that one. So we use and I think introduce the term multi-country immersers to capture, I would say, a subset under the umbrella of transnationalism of people who lived in 3 or more countries for a significant period of time, which we define as 3 or more years, just for the purposes of our research, to really emphasize the depth of that experience, or in terms of time. And then we look specifically at these immersers having deep immersive acculturation experiences in the countries that they're in. So we define that as having deep connection to the culture, the language, and professional or educational experiences in the host countries. Because in looking at the different research, and my dissertation, which Sanjay supported as my chair, we looked at a lot of the research and tried to kind of consolidate these terms and understandings of it just to get a little better clarity. And we specifically wanted to look at this population because it hadn't been studied in that sense. So there's like literature on global nomads, but there were no immersive requirements, for example. And we thought that there's a difference in terms of the depth of your experience and contact with the countries.
Yeah, I really resonate with that because as somebody who was a diplomat's son, I can say that I've lived in different countries, but there were some countries where well, at least at the time, to immerse myself would have been either inappropriate or dangerous. And so you kind of left wondering, what exactly did I get from this country and how did this country impact me? It did, but in ways that are perhaps harder to identify because I can't actually, there's very little meat there for me to say, well, yes, this tradition or this way of thinking or that way of being. And so that's very interesting that you focus really on immersion as a characteristic. That's yeah, very, very interesting.
And that brings us to the next question, which I think you might have already answered, right? What is the difference between the MCIs, so the multi-country immersers, to other people who have only, and I say only, and in inverted commas, lived in one or two countries? The two countries concept has been studied, right? But what you are doing is very different.
Yeah, so I touched upon this a little bit in my background. So I started this interest topic just related to my own personal lived experience, that I noticed a difference really between my, let's say, my second country, or in this case, this first time that I went abroad, where I was a lot more focused on really adapting to the culture and the language. And in this case, it was Germany. I hadn't had German before. I had had Spanish. So I was really focused on really trying to learn and understand and immerse myself. And then I would say it shifted more. And it was the same when I lived in Mexico. It was a lot more immersive. And then for me personally, living in the Netherlands opened up a little bit more of I'm going to kind of maintain aspects of myself, and adapt, absolutely, but more, I think I had a lot more of a connection to this broader, just kind of international, maybe lifestyle. I built some sense of openness to, maybe I could live somewhere else, or I didn't really quite know what the future would look like. It wasn't tied to a particular country. And so in talking about that with Sanjay, also on a cultural perspective, not necessarily just at a country level, even though that's what we focused on in our research, we wanted to really understand, like, what is the psychological process and how does that differ? And we thought it could, transpire that in that first and second country, we're doing this kind of binary comparison. For example, in this country, we eat this food. In that country, we eat that food, and kind of switching between frames. And then in that third country and beyond, it might be more like, what does food represent? Or how do people eat in a particular culture or in society? So we wanted to better understand what that was like by starting with people that really immerse themselves deeply into multiple countries.
Right. It sounds like those almost I'm seeing ideas and concepts that get more and more abstract in a sense, the more countries you visit, more general and more abstract, where you can ask questions and identify with ideas and practices that are more kind of, they're just larger, if that makes any sense. I'm kind of thinking out loud here.
And that was exactly what we theorized, and
Yeah.
we'll talk more about our findings, but I do think that we see that. And it's not just specific to this population, but we thought that the multiple immersive experiences just creates a kind of broader, more symbolic frame and thinking.
Yes, yeah.
Almost on a different level, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're interested in this concept called transnational identity, and you want to understand the processes by which people come to develop this identity, although we'll kind of learn at the end that there's many ways to have a transnational identity. And so to do this, you recruited a sample of multi-country immersers, and you used methods from qualitative research. And you basically asked them a bunch of interview questions to extract broad themes from the responses. And just like on a specific methodological detail, how many multicultural immersers did participated and in your study, and maybe what kind of backgrounds, like who were these folks? What kind of backgrounds did they come from exactly?
I'm happy to answer this one. So
Sure.
Courtney is the first author of this study, and she was the interviewer. She's kind of the lead researcher in this team. So she did a lot of the heavy lifting. And she met with 10 individuals for the qualitative interviews, which is kind of typical size sample. They
Yes,
were
yes, yes.
aged 24 to 33, 6 women, 5 men, and each had lived in 3 countries for at least 3 years, as per kind of our definition of MCCs. Some had lived in 4 or 5 countries, and everyone in the sample spoke 2 or more languages fluently. Some of the people had moved for family's work or for school or for employment, repatriation or language immersion goals. And, you know, the article kind of more fully details each participant's trajectory. But just as an example, one of the participants had lived in Kenya, the United Kingdom, and the US. Another participant had lived in India, Hong Kong, and the US. A third, France, Mexico, and Colombia. And so it was important that people came and had experiences in different continents. That I think is also important. A lot. Sometimes the research can be very much not representative of our globe or even the global South. And so our participants had those kinds of experiences. So it spanned continents. 3 of the people had dual citizenship, while the rest had a primary country or primary citizenship. And maybe also notable is that there was a larger survey that was distributed widely, and 349 people filled that out. And then the sample was kind of selected from that large group by people who met the criteria, and we invited folks to participate and folks who might be interested in talking about their lived experiences.
Interesting. And just as a quick follow-up, how, as a general technique, how did you ensure that immersion bit?
Yeah, I think in our survey, there was just a question asking, where have you lived and how long? And kind of the begin and kind of chronology of people's lives. And to see that it was 3 or more years and that it was in a specific place. And we asked about some of the building blocks of the immersive part: language, ability to work, kind of professional education. We asked each of those things about each of them. So it was a pretty extensive questionnaire. And then we invited some folks. So if folks had shorter experiences in more places or didn't meet the criteria, we didn't include them in this kind of subsample.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Interesting.
And then the final interview was just with, not just, but to understand that the sample was big enough. So it was 10 participants. Can you give us some of the interview questions, and maybe also let us know how long did the interviews more or less last?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take that one. So we built our questions really, again, we tried to go as cross-disciplinary as possible, looking at immigration, identity broadly, this approach called the life interview model. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that, but just the idea of helping people share their stories chronologically and then talking maybe about some of the broader questions versus us going in initially and saying, what's your identity?
Right.
So we really liked, and we're both clinical people. We do primarily psychotherapy. So we thought that there's a richness and a relationship at the same time happening as people were really just talking about their experience in each country. in describing their life. And so some of the questions, and then we asked the same questions, more broadly speaking, for each country that they lived in. And then we coded our research based on people whose countries they met that criteria for. So they were there 3 or more years. We had plenty of people that had lived in other countries, but it wasn't, a full 3 years, for example. So we just coded the ones that were that had that depth of immersion in their experience with the language and the time and factors like that. And so some of the questions that we asked for each of the countries that they were in were things like, describe what was it like for you at a more personal level trying to adapt in that country? What support services did you have access to? We wanted to capture this because I think in a lot of the TCK samples, we don't necessarily talk about this, but having support, it might be important. What was it like for you to communicate and build relationships with other people throughout your time in that country? Describe one of the most difficult experiences that you faced. And then how do you think that your time in that country affected your identity? And then we basically just asked a similar broad set of questions for each next country that they lived in. And then we got at some of the broader like identity and psychological questions at the end. And examples of that were, how do you feel like you've changed from your international experiences? And I really like this one. What do you tell people when they ask you where you're from? That's a very complex,
$1 million question.
so
Yeah.
simple, right? It sounds so simple and yet
Oh my
so
gosh.
complex.
We all love this question, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we'll share in our findings how people react to a question like that. And then things like, what kind of things go inside your head when telling somebody about this or about your experience? And then which countries do you consider when thinking about your identity? So those are some examples. And our interviews were quite lengthy using that life interview model. So our range, I have it right here. It was 102 minutes to 214 minutes. So pretty long.
Wow.
And our average length was 147 minutes, so a little over 2 hours.
Yeah. I'm really curious, Courtney. So, you were doing this as a researcher, and you mentioned that you had your psychologist hat on, but you're also somebody who went through this. And so I'm wondering, as these answers came in, and as you had these conversations, what was going on through your head? Were there moments where you were going, "Oh my God, yes"? Were there things you wanted to react to? Like
And to share?
Yeah, just tell us a little bit about that process. Were you discovering things about yourself and your experience as you were doing this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely heard a lot of themes that I could relate to, or particular participants. It was like, oh my goodness, you just captured something that I experienced, And then I think I also, not necessarily surprised, but I felt grateful in the sense of vulnerability when people are sharing, I think especially some of their more painful experiences living abroad, and then also just around diversity and how we look on the outside versus how we feel on the inside. And are we seen as looking like the country that we're in, or are we really seen and being experienced as an other? And is there discrimination? So those were the ones that were clearly harder, and they felt a lot more therapeutic in the sense of, there's also a lot of pain and a lot of individual differences in this experience. So yeah, I think it was a range.
What I like especially is that you asked about every country. So you said you sort of asked more or less the same questions about every country, whereas very often all the countries are thrown into one pot. You ask the question and then you answer depending on which country comes to mind, and you made them really think. You really made them think through every country, through every stay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So very, very rich interview process. And from these interviews, so again, for listeners, you're trying to capture a sense of the processes that led to these people developing a transnational identity. And from, so you're, asking them questions, and you're trying to see what are the major themes related to that pop out. And you, in your paper, both of you describe three major themes that seem to capture the processes that drive the formation of this transnational identity. And I can name them here, but we'll go through them specifically. So you have a theme that's specifically on adaptation experiences, a theme that's specifically on experiences of connection and disconnection, and a theme that has to do with individual identity dimensions. So let's start with this first one, this theme of adaptation experiences. It's very rich and detailed in your paper. What kind of general sense can you tell us, what can you give us about this first identity process, adaptation experience?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about this. I think one of the keys to the adaptation piece that people reported was the intensity of the process, and as well as the speed of the process. Of settling into a new place, and that kind of repeated itself at this kind of iterative process. I think that one of the most important pieces of the adaptation results was that people had both positive experiences of that quick, intense adaptation and difficult experiences. That in kind of adapting linguistically, socially, culturally, academically, professionally, these different domains, it could be both very meaningful and very enriching, and also really challenging at the same time. I think one of the things that's unique about the results we come up with around adaptation is it does allude to what we talked about earlier in our conversation about this kind of higher level of thinking, and being able to step back. A lot of the participants talked about a kind of comparative thinking that was maybe less here and there, but kind of almost like, how do different systems think about this concept? And there was the possibility of cross-systemic thinking, kind of comparative thinking. This is how we do things here. This is here. What is the meta level around that, and kind of getting to that? And one of the terms we used is something called cultural hybridism, where it's kind of a sculpture that has pieces from each of the different cultural experiences. So it kind of expands on traditional ideas of like culture shock, or like having an experience in a bubble with like-minded subcultures in a new place, but more like one is building and developing these kinds of experiences that fit in and kind of add to a kind of self in development, a hybrid self. So, I mean, I think one of the things is that adaptation is something that's almost universally discussed in any kind of migratory experience. But I think the things that we really highlighted in this theme were really the complexity and the kind of meta adaptations that would occur, kind of more than just this particular place, but kind of that iterative process of comparing, how is this different or similar to past experiences, and how do I kind of construct a new hybrid self out of that?
I can't help but ask, Sanjay, and because your story is one of being a first generation with immigrant parents. Were you, as a child, were you aware of the adaptation struggles or process in your parents? Is that something you were always aware of? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, like, in my family of origin, my parents always provided a very superficial kind of surface reason for their immigration, or even they initially conceived of their immigration as temporary, and then it became more permanent because of life circumstances. but one of the things that has really always intrigued me is I think when you peel away those layers, there's a lot of complexity to that adaptation. And it came only when I was a young adult did I learn that some of the reasons I thought my parents had immigrated were completely wrong. That there were their own kinds of dramas and traumas that they were resolving that only come out, decades later. And I think that's
fascinating.
That's really an interesting kind of process to realize how deep it can kind of run. And I think that, to be honest, too, I think coming out of a kind of dual here and there frame, some of this research and some of my connection with Courtney has really expanded the ability to think about what is it like to have an experience that allows for a third, or to compare in threes, which is a common practice in kind of anthropology or kind of comparative studies. You would want to look at not just two, but three or more. And it really adds something different that can be generalized, but it's somehow going from the case of two to the case of three. Something happens in that extra dimensionality that's just beautiful and harder to capture and
very enriching.
Yeah.
Thank you for Go ahead.
No, and sometimes if it gets to three, sometimes you cannot explain it black and white anymore.
No, that's it.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, three, so you had the other process that you pointed out is connection and disconnection. Also very complex. Can you sort of explain it a little bit for us and for our listeners?
Sure. I think connection and disconnection had a number of parts as a broad theme. One of the questions that Courtney had spoken a few minutes ago was about systems and support from systems. And there was a lot of seeking and receiving support from different kinds of systems. I'll just talk about a few of some of the ideas that emerged from the study that are particularly interesting. One concept was this idea of a distance-proof relationship.
Oh, yes.
A relationship that could last and endure across one's journey. And, there's a kind of way in which there could be deep and intimate friendships in some countries, and then also superficial and dissatisfying relationships in other countries. That there's also the possibility of lost relationships or detached relationships. But the one aspect of resilience was meeting people where they could invest and know that this person would be someone they could return to even across space and time. And some of the complexities of that kind of connection and disconnection also in terms of hardships, like when people experience trauma or death or loss, how to navigate being in a different place across that distance. There was, this might not be surprising, a lot of feelings of isolation and not fully belonging that were expressed by participants. Challenging experiences with discrimination, ignorance by others, microaggressions of various kinds. But one of the things that we tried to get at is the idea of home and what home is. And this was a kind of deep aspect of the kind of analysis of these findings that, and this might not be surprising, but for many participants, home was many places for them. It was a complex idea. It was not able to be summed up as a place or a house or a language. It was this kind of, again, this hybridized experience. And that's both could be very meaningful and also challenging. It was sometimes difficult for people, felt it was difficult to stay in one place, felt a little uncertain about where they might end up in the future. And so home becomes this really complicated journey. It's almost like a lot of our results show how important the process is. And words like home that signify a place, or words like identity, become a process for these folks.
Andrea, I feel like going off script because we have time. I need to ask this question.
Go off script.
to both of you, because again, the context concept of home came up. Courtney, where/what is home to you?
Oh,
How do you define this in 2 minutes or less?
no, you are
Yes.
not allowed to ask that question. Let's cut here.
No,
Let's cut
no,
the
no, no,
podcast.
no, no, no. I'm asking it. Tell me
Going
No,
down
about
that
home,
route.
sure.
Courtney.
Okay.
I'll ask it
I
this
want
way.
to give
Tell me
my,
about home.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
I can give my answer, but I last week had a session with a transnational client who gave the
Mm.
most beautiful conception that it's almost like mine
Okay.
doesn't even relate. It was like home is emotional intimacy of being
Oh,
with
yeah.
all of my favorite people where I'm accepted and I'm free. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing.
Yeah.
So I feel like even their experience hearing that made me change even my own conception of home. Like
Right.
that's a better conception of home. I like emotional intimacy being on the definition
Indeed.
of what home means for
Indeed.
me. But for me,
Yeah.
home is the people that I love that could exist across landscapes. Like it's not
Nice. Beautifully
necessarily
said.
tied to a particular place. For me, I feel home when I get to feel free. And I feel free when I get to immerse myself in new experiences while maintaining the things I love.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's an
Mhm.
openness to my sense of home. But
Beautiful. Beautiful. And I want to make
Mm.
sure, because I find that often when we have discussions about this, some people might think that the opposite of that is somehow wrong, and it's not, right? If a listener is going, well, home to me is this particular city and this particular neighborhood, that's great too, right? We're not
yes,
saying that there's something more, right? Because often I find that when we study multiculturalism or third culture kids, there's kind of this us versus that, like, monocultural folks versus bicultural folks and so on. And I often, think about some listeners going, well, is there something wrong with home being a place? And I want to tell listeners, no, it's not at all.
No.
In fact, it's just as beautiful. But your answer, Courtney, was equally beautiful. Sanjay, what about you? What/where is home?
Exactly.
Tell us about home.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think I have a similar resonance with Courtney. I think of home as having to do with communities and people, and maybe even the
Yeah.
idea of chosen family in a
Mhm.
complicated way. Like that term really resonates for me. Um, and there, maybe we have a shared piece of challenging more traditional notions of
Yeah.
home
Mm.
being a place or a particular kind of food. I can have those um, experiences and memories too. But I think for me, even having them is always imbued with a sense of this is also not home. It both
Mm.
fits and it doesn't fit. And
And it
that
doesn't.
binary, something has to emerge out of it that
Yeah.
can be really powerful and hard. I mean, I think one of the things that you're asking is, there's advantages and disadvantages to complexifying this, right? There's a
Yes.
sadness to it too, and a
Yes.
beauty. And
Yes.
when home is
Yes.
emotional intimacy or when home is community, it's so much harder to sometimes
Yes.
construct that or to just
Yeah.
go to your favorite place to eat in your home city and just have a great meal and feel good. And that's wonderful too. But once one has had this transnational experiences, it's harder to return to that and not feel, oh my, there's a lot here. There's a lot of what
Yeah.
in the negative space, there's a lot of meaning as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Well
I
said.
think we're
Well
going to
said.
be really mean and ask Mathieu the same question now. Where is
Oh
Yes.
home?
no. You know what? I thought
Yeah.
about this recently. Here's an answer that's not very satisfying, but is
Okay.
deeply true. The answer, and I mean that with no sarcasm at all, I'm not sure. I'm
Mm.
not sure where home is or what home is. And
hmm.
that's what I'll say about that. I agree with everything you said, the intimacy. Um, when I think about it, it's like a cloud of vapors. It's too cloudy. I don't know, and I want to legitimize that in the sense that it's okay to not know. I'm not in
Yeah.
distress about it. I just
Okay.
don't know what home is, and I somehow, for some reason, I seem to be okay with it. And now, Andrea, obviously, I have to throw it to you, Andrea.
Obviously.
What
obviously.
slash
Okay.
where?
Mine is also complex because I live in Mexico with my husband, so I feel home here. When I'm with my daughter who lives in San Francisco, I'm at home where she is. When I visit my mom who lives in Germany, I say I'm home there. And funnily enough, because my husband is in the hotel tourism business, so we've actually physically lived in many hotels. So we also have the tendency in whatever hotel or Airbnb we stay, after when we're all on vacation and we go back to that place, we also say, okay, let's go home. So it's also a broad term in our family, and I'm also okay with it. And I don't want to be pinned down to give like
Yeah.
a concrete answer.
Oh, to me, home is the TCK Research Podcast. How bad is that?
Oh, yay!
Oh, I feel dirty promoting my own podcast on
On
my
the
own podcast.
podcast and on the podcast.
Yes, I know. All right. Back to the formal interview because you've spoken about. So we mentioned three themes that seem to contribute to this emerging sense of transnational identities. So you mentioned a theme related to adaptation, a theme related to experiences of connection and disconnection. And you also identified a third theme, which is a theme that centers more on individual identity and its many faceted facets and dimensions. What can you share with listeners about this specific space or theme?
Yeah. I think we've already started to talk about it through this question of
Mm,
home and our own experiences. One of the things that came up that maybe is very expectable is many participants talked about their experiences with traditional concepts like diversity and multiculturalism. The idea of like feeling unique in terms of having a perspective or a vantage point that they were able to relate to a kind of diverse experience of cultures or their ethnicity, also social class and kind of economics of their experience in different places, and be able to compare that. One other thing that was really interesting that emerged from the data was that the folks in our sample had what we called open personalities. There was a lot of empathy, there was a lot of sociability, there was a lot of adaptability. So some of those traits that allow you to be open to others, to other experiences were present. And together with those positive traits and open, there was also some complex aspects of their identities, complex psychological experiences. Sometimes people felt it was very difficult to know who they were or how to explain themselves to others. We saw that a little bit in our round robin a
yes,
minute ago.
yeah, I agree.
And then when people asked questions like, where are you from? What was your favorite country? Or where will you end up long term? That it could be both exhausting, difficult, and maybe even a question like, where is home? Requires a longer kind of answer and maybe even a self-consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think we see both in this last identity dimension at the broad level, some of the both strengths and resilience, and also some of the challenges and struggles that were there at a 10,000 foot level. These three themes were very high level, and then
Yeah.
I think in a minute, Courtney's going to try to flesh them out a little bit and talk about some of the people specific experiences and examples.
Yeah, because the three overarching themes here comes my word, spiral. And Courtney,
Right.
I'm sure you're going to explain the visual to us that you had included in your paper. Spiral sort of into this transformed hybrid transnational identity. Can you give us examples of the different types and complex transnational identities that MCIs can develop?
Yes, absolutely. So I think thinking about the themes that we mentioned, and then imagine having those themes in country one or And then in country two, it's a little different or similar. And then you're relating that to your last experience. Like, again, we're getting at just the complexities of it's not just here versus there. It's a little bit in between. And then that's going to influence the next stage or the next country. And so basically we saw that just with these multiple iterations of that cycle and those types of themes, people did report going on to develop a sort of hybridized transnational identity. So in contrast with even my own assumption that I maybe have more of a global openness and identity where I relate to, I'm a little bit of all of the countries that I've lived in, and I could kind of, live somewhere else, not a problem, that excites me. That's not what everybody experienced in our population. And we were both excited and somewhat surprised, I would say, to see that even within this population, there is a lot of diversity. So we like to think of it, I guess, as more of a spectrum, if that's helpful, with four different subgroups within this umbrella of having some degree of a transnational identity. So the four subgroups that we found were being from my home country, but having lived in other countries. That would be number one. Number two would be being bicultural or tricultural. Number three would be being a blend of some countries, but not all countries. Also find interesting. And then number four was being a blend of all the countries that I lived in. And so this, I think it's really nice. And I invite the listeners too, to listen to some of these quotes and themes shared by other participants and just see if you can relate to them, or even maybe we can relate to multiple ones, which is also not to confuse everybody, but that's also something that we saw. Maybe in a particular country, I feel more like connected to my roots because I miss them. And then I'm in this other setting and I feel like a blend, or like, so just the idea that identities are fluid, but it's still helpful to think about the different conceptions of identity. So thinking about that first theme, being from my home country, but having lived in other countries, that was shared by two participants, so 2 out of our 10. One participant, Jamila, describes this as, it's so clear that I'm Kenyan. I sometimes lived in these other countries, but I myself consider myself Kenyan. It's where I lived a substantial part of my life, where my family is, where I grew up, what made me be who I am today. And it's where I feel like I belong most. So in this example, she describes how the strong roots and sense of belonging she has to her home country really shapes how she sees her overall identity. And then the second subgroup is being bicultural or tricultural. One participant, that was shared by 3 participants, so 3 out of the 10. One participant, Gabriela, describes her bicultural identity as, quote, I'm Mexican and French. I mean, Colombia, we were there for several years. It affected who I am, but I'm not from there. And then another participant, Aya, describes having a tricultural identity and quotes, I'm tricultural. I'm that Latin American culture, that American culture, and then that Japanese culture. And then the third subgroup is being a blend of some countries, but not all countries that I've lived in. That was shared by 2 participants, so 2 out of the 10. And for these participants, they identified some countries that they consider as part of their overall identity, and others don't quite make the cut. And the difference is really having a stronger sense of closeness, belonging, connection, or roots to particular countries, and others less so. I would also like to wonder too, what were the experiences of the ones that we excluded? Did we feel other there? Was there a trauma there? Did I not integrate there, right? That's definitely, I would imagine, is going to influence it. And participants did describe that. So one example of this type of identity was shared by a participant who and these are all pseudonym names, so these are not their actual names. We try to protect everybody's identity, but Daniel describes two European countries he lived in as part of his identity and relates to having a broadly European identity, and then explains that he omits the United States from his identity and explains why. He says, I wouldn't say that I'm American. I just associate a lot of things that I've done and my experiences with America, but I will never consider myself American. And then the last one being a blend of all countries that I've lived in. That was shared by two participants. One participant, who we called Hannah, says, I usually say, well, I'm originally from city in India, but I mostly grew up in Hong Kong and I did college in the US. I feel like a little of all of these. I personally relate to that one.
You do.
Another participant, Bahira, says what it means to be, Bahira speaks about each country that she's lived in and then talks about the commonality across those as related to her identity, and says what it means to be all of that is to incorporate some aspect of humanity within yourself. And to understand that we all have things in common you can go back to no matter which country you end up in. So these
Beautiful.
were some examples of the different themes, and I hope it's
cool
and relatable for our listeners.
I think it will be, and thank you for sharing those. And by the way, we Andrea and I were struck by some of the quotes as well, and I'm going to share mine because it's so. So this is a quote from your paper from a participant, and when I read this, it was like, well, yes, this is so much it in my experience. Somebody, I don't know the pseudonym of the person, but said, quote, I definitely consider myself probably Colombian. And I thought, definitely, probably? Yes, I get that. This is the, I don't know, kind of spirit, you know. And Andrea, what was your favorite
Mine
thought?
was, and and I have a follow-up question for Courtney because I understood it in the following way. That I imagine the world in the back of my head. I always carry part of each identity with me or each country with me whenever I'm looking at a situation. And the person, it was written as, and I know you're not allowed to change words, right? From the interviews that you have conducted. So it actually read, I imagine the back of the world in my head. But it was, I imagine the world in the back of my head, right?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure about that. I would have to look at it, but however it was stated in the paper is how the participant
That's how it
shared.
says.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Matthew and I had a discussion about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But so we would imagine the back of the person's head being the back of the globe, a part of the globe, right? That's how you imagined it,
Well, the
Andrea?
globe fits in, right? If you look at it from the side,
Yeah.
globe
It's
fits
like
in.
what a beautiful picture. And
Yeah.
so all of this to say that there, you know, for listeners and viewers, there's some beautiful quotes in there that you might resonate
Yeah.
with. And by the way, we will provide, if you look, listeners and viewers, if you look at the show notes, you will notice that you have the emails of both our guests, and our guests have offered that if you want the paper, you can email them, right? And they will provide it for you, because otherwise you need to be part of an institution to have access to the paper. So thank you for that, by the way. So we're gonna. I assume we have time for a few more, Andrea. I'm not keeping track of time, but I'm also mindful of Sanjay and the fact that he has to go soon. But so tell us, were there? So actually, let's talk about some of the limitations of the study, because we've been obviously it's a wonderful study, it's a worthy study, but like any study, we always have to be mindful of our limitations. And limitations are usually, they're not bad, because they are motivations to push the study further and the research further. So what are some of the limitations that both of you, or either of you, are particularly mindful of in this particular study?
Sanjay, do you want to answer that one, or
Yeah, hang on.
as well?
Silence my phone.
Sure.
Well, I think one of the larger limitations that is something people think about with all qualitative research is, um, it is one thing you might resonate with in the work we did is there's a lot of depth, but it's a small sample. It's 10, it's 10 people. And I think that like ideally this kind of research would kind of pivot between some small sample and some large sample kind of numerical work and back again. And that kind of be a line of research that could expand upon this. Because I think in trying to extract the meaning, it also glosses some important differences. And we tried to make our model complex in that idea of a spiral. But I think that some of the questions and subparts that could be a limitation have to do with I think we do well with a diversity of our sample, but it could be even more diverse. It could be really different to kind of compare people whose primary experiences are in North American or European context versus other places, and what the differences are that have to do with social class and mobility and access. And some of the reasons people immigrate are implicated with privilege, and some are implicated with less privilege. And I think those are maybe important limitations to kind of think through or to kind of weigh in terms of the research. But I think given the state of the literature, our contribution allows a lot of jumping off points. But I don't know, Courtney, do you have any thoughts about limitations?
Yeah, I mean, I think limitations really relate to the broader landscape of this type of research, and where I encourage, excited, eager students and people wanting to do more research in this topic to consider. But I think it is the limitations in terms of just the lack of interdisciplinary collaboration. Like, we come up with a lot of themes, we capture things, and we try to do that by looking at this sample, and we try to keep the sample diverse. But things that we need to better cipher out are, things like age in which you go abroad. How much does that really influence identity? Access to support and resources. How much does that influence one's experience? Choice. That's huge. That comes up a lot, right? If I feel forced or I have a negative experience, I actually, in working as a therapist, talked with a good amount of people that said, I heard about this thing called third culture kids, but I hated my experience when I was abroad, and I don't want anything to do with that. And then maybe later they have a more positive experience, or they learn about it and they're a little bit more open. But I think choice and how it was experienced, was it something I desired or not, is a major factor. And also, family differences, diversity differences. So I think that we have a lot that we can continue to unpack and relate to some of the broader literature.
Yeah, so this is almost a call to action to anybody who's interested in in either doing continuing research or starting, their research path down that path. Yeah, definitely.
And especially for people who have thought so far that they don't fit into the TCK frame, CCK frame, expats, I think your term MCIs opens lots of other research doors.
Yeah.
What do you think how can you think, no, that's not what I wanted to say. How do you think your study could be useful for global mobile families, expat families that are listening to us?
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of your invited participants say the same thing, but I really think reading the full paper could be helpful.
Right? Yes.
Especially just because it is qualitative. There's less qualitative research, which means people's lived experiences and quotes out there. I think it's really nice in helping people when they're making that journey or going abroad or thinking about their next, life choice, or they're stuck or they're in therapy, like, what's going on with me? it's just a really nice point to hear some stories of people that have maybe shared some similar experiences to feel less alone if somebody might not feel that captured in their like physical environment that they're in. So I just really find the power of reading this to be really helpful. And then same with anybody that works with multi-country immersers, third culture kids, transnationals, immigrants, encouraging similarly that, they can think about some of these themes or read the article and just helping with some of that understanding, aloneness. Just that reflective process.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you.
Sanjay, do you want to add to that before we go? Is there a particular, as a
I was just going to
therapist
say
yourself?
that, I mean, I think there's so many different ways to answer this question via the therapy process or via the kind of dialogue process. We're at a interesting socio-political moment here in the US around immigration, and a complicated one where I think sometimes the value of immigrants is framed largely through economic impact or financial impact. And I think that there's so much more than that. There's like benefits systemically and socially to having space for adaptive experiences. And I think that, to me, our study and our work is about moving beyond these labels or boxes. I think we very quickly want to put people into a certain box or say, oh, they're an immigrant, or they're someone who lived in these places, or their home is here. And there's something about listening and openness and kind of understanding our biases that comes out of this work in listening to people's lived experience. And I think if we can find that way, whether in therapy or in our communities or with people we meet, to like dialogue and truly listen and hear what people's lived experiences are and share our own, whether it's grounded in a local experience, there can be something beautiful that comes out of that, both positive and resilient, and also giving us space to kind of look at certain kinds of anxieties, fears, dissonances that are part of that. And so many folks in our sample in the study talked about some aspects of trying to reach that transcendent, that resilient piece, and how it also highlights the challenge. And I think there's something really wonderful about a dialogue that can come out with ourselves, with each other, with the places we call the places we live, that could be really meaningful. And obviously, we as therapists really privilege that therapeutic space as a place to explore and be curious and open. But in a way, having experiences of deep experiences of exchange can be super valuable to that kind of growth. And really, I think we're all interested in growth. And hopefully there can be a message about how to promote that growth that comes out of our work.
Fantastic. Well, and let's hope the podcast, well, not let's hope, I know it will, that the podcast will be part of this for some people, that to get them thinking about all these wonderful concepts and processes running in themselves. And so listeners, viewers, don't hesitate to share any comments, questions, thoughts that you had while listening. Listen, we want to thank you very much, Sanjay and Courtney, for coming on. Thank you so much for sharing your research work, your wisdom with us. It's been a wonderful, I assume it's been an hour. It just went by like that.
Yes, it went by fast.
It's been wonderful. So we want to thank you again and again. For listeners, if you're interested in getting the full paper, and we recommend you do, because there's some wonderful excerpts and they go into more details about everything they spoke about here in the podcast, reach out to them using the addresses that are in the show notes. Thank you again, Courtney, Sanjay.
Thank you both for making the time for us.
Fantastic.
Thank you also for taking the time.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of the TCK Research Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please subscribe, like, and share our podcast, and leave us a review. It really helps others find us. If you have any questions or comments, please write to us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com.
We'd love to hear from you, and we promise we'll answer all emails. We wish you a good day wherever you are, and we hope you'll join us again for the next episode.